Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the 2022 Toyota Tundra. We're going to do a full and thorough technical review. We're going to look at the engine, the transmission, the drivetrain, suspension, and we're going to look underneath the truck. We'll lift it up, look at everything, and see what changed in the 2022 Tundra compared to the previous one, and more right after this. Let's start with the engine. This is a brand new 3.5 liter or 3.4 liter V35A FTS. A variant of this engine was found in the Lexus LS500 that started in 2018, but this is slightly different than that. There's actually been some changes to this that differentiated from the model in the Lexus LS500. So let's start first with the mechanical stuff, the stuff we can't really see, internals. So this is an all aluminum head, all aluminum block. That is not something new. We have seen this for a while, but something special about the cylinder head. Let's start with the cylinder head. First, the valve seats are laser clad. And the reason they went through this whole complication is this is a dynamic force engine. Let me explain. So the dynamic force engine, instead of the air charge coming and making a curve as it goes over the intake valve to go in, like the air and fuel mixture, in this engine, there's no curve. It is just a straight path where the charge comes in at high velocity and it actually makes a twirl. It's called high tumble flow. That increases the thermal efficiency and makes everything flow very well for this engine. So they had to go the laser clad design to make that valve sit in a position where you have a straight path into the combustion chamber. That is actually something not unique to this engine. This is all the dynamic force engines, the M20, the A25A, they all have this feature, but that's what dynamic force means. It's high tumble flow. Moving on to the cylinder head, the exhaust manifold is actually integrated into the cylinder head, so there's actually no exhaust manifolds. The turbos immediately connect to the cylinder head. Something else on the cylinder head, which is love or hate relationship, if you would, the valve covers are actually plastic. We've had plastic valve covers for a while. From my experience working on these things every day, I haven't really seen issues with the plastic valve covers, no cracking, no warpage, no issues. But I also have to say that they have been on some models that are not very old. Time will tell, we'll see how these plastic valve covers hold up, but they seem to be good quality. Moving on to the front of the engine and the timing. This is a timing chain engine, of course, with an interesting design for the timing chains. There's actually 3 timing chains, 4 if you count the oil pump. We'll get to the oil pump in a minute. There is 2 chains between the 2 cam gears, and then 2 on this side, and then 1 big chain that drives both cams to the crankshaft. And then there is a tiny little chain that drives the oil pump. Previously, in the previous engine, the V8, the oil pump was actually driven by the nose of the crank. It was right in the middle of the timing cover. It was driven by the crank. But now we have a chain. In the old engine, we had 4 chains in a different configuration, 2 between each cam, and then 2 that drive each bank, each side of the engine. So it's a different configuration, same number, but that little chain that drives the oil pump is very small, and I wouldn't count it as a timing chain per se. So there's technically 3 timing chains. The front cover design is different. This is something we've seen with the dynamic force engines, the A25, the M20. There's actually 2 front timing covers, 1 in the back, and then all the timing gears and all your chains and everything goes on, and then a top cover that goes in the front. Something unique about this engine, actually all the dynamic force engines, a common spot for leaks from the front timing cover on older models was the area where the front cover meets the cylinder head and meets the block. In this engine and in all the dynamic forces, that area does not have sealer around it. The front cover kind of loops up and back in, leaving that area open where the head meets the block. That way we don't have those common leaks from that weak point, which is actually a design improvement. Let's talk about the lubrication system, and actually things are basic and simple here. Like I said, the oil pump is chain driven, but it actually is still part of the front cover. It lives in the front timing cover, but then it has a chain that the block drives it off of. There's something interesting about this engine, which was a little bit of a surprise. In the A25 and the M20, we have a variable oil system that is controlled by a solenoid, and it varies the oil pressure. In this, it's business as usual. This is old school. There's actually none of that. The oil pump, you rev the engine up, the oil pump speeds up. There's a pressure relief valve that is mechanical. The oiling system in this engine is all mechanical. There's nothing electronic about it, other than a pressure sensor and this stuff. But driving the oil pump, there's nothing electronic that changes the oil pump output, which is good. Let's talk about the cooling system of the V35A. Things are actually interesting, and they were quite a surprise when this engine we finally got the final version of this engine in production. The cooling system is actually split into two. There is the cooling system, the conventional one to cool the engine and everything, and then there is the turbo cooling system. We'll get into the turbo cooling system as we talk about the turbos. The engine cooling system is actually pretty conventional. There is no electric water pump. There is no heated thermostat. There is something about, this is the first change between this configuration and the LS500. The LS500 actually had a coolant valve that it doesn't have a thermostat, it just had a coolant valve that changed the coolant flow wherever it needs to go, and things were a little more complicated. But here you have a good old school thermostat, not even heated, very conventional. You have a good old mechanical water pump that sits very proudly in the middle. Nothing really strange about this cooling system. Something else that is actually strange about the cooling system is the mechanical fan, that cooling fan. It is a mechanical fan, however, it has a solenoid that can control when the fan speeds up or slows down. So basically the computer can control the mechanical fan. But I wonder, if we went through all that trouble, why not just put an electric fan? That was kind of a surprise that they a little bit over-engineered a mechanical part instead of just putting a good old electric cooling fan that you can control much more precisely and makes it a little bit less complicated. But that's what they went with. Let's talk about the twin turbos, and this is what everybody's been wondering about. So this engine is twin turbocharged, one turbo on the left, one turbo on the right. They're equal size. They're very actually similar. And something that the turbos do is break the engine in half. You have two air filters feeding the two turbos, and you have two hoses coming out of the turbos into the intercooler. And this intercooler, and this is another thing that is different from this and the LS500. The LS500 had actually two completely separate intercoolers. This has an integrated intercooler. It's still two units, but they integrate and they mix into one throttle body. Let's talk about the cooling side of the turbos, because in addition to coolant lines going to the turbos themselves, there's actually the intercooler side of things. This intercooler, you notice, not like the cool Supras of the past, it doesn't sit all the way in the front. This is an air-to-water intercooler. It uses a separate coolant circuit to cool the charge before it goes into the engine. The cooler the charge, the denser it is, and better and more efficient it is. Things get a little complicated and unconventional when we go into the intercooler system and its cooling circuit. So from these intercoolers, there is an electric water pump that drives the coolant in this circuit, not a mechanical one. Let's talk about the flow of coolant in the separate circuit for the intercooler. The electric water pump sends the coolant first to the intercooler to cool the charge. Once it leaves that, it goes to the turbos to cool them, because you don't want to send it to the turbo first and then the coolant gets really hot. Now it can no longer cool that charge because the temperature difference here is very big. The turbos will get a lot hotter than the charge. So after it leaves the turbocharge, and they're separate circuits, one for the left, one for the right, it actually comes around and goes to two separate radiators. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, in addition to the engine radiator, which is very big, sits right here, there's actually two more radiators in the Tundra. One for the left bank, one for the right bank, and this little electric water pump actually circulates the coolant between the intercooler and the turbos continuously. And the cool thing about that is it could actually do that even with the car off if needed. That is something very interesting. And if we were just driven by the mechanical water pump, as soon as you shut that thing off, the turbos are too hot. There's no way to circulate the coolant to cool things down. But in this case, because you have an electric water pump, it will continue to circulate the coolant to cool those turbos down. It wouldn't cook the seals and the oil inside. Going back to the turbos, they're actually not very large turbos. They're not meant for performance only. They're meant for efficiency as well, so they don't need to be very large. The larger the turbos, the more lag we have, and that's not good in a truck like this. It's going to be daily driven. So something about the turbos, they have wastegates, and the wastegate is basically a way to control the pressure of the turbo. Because if you rev this engine very high, this turbo is going to just keep spinning and it's going to keep generating pressure. You need a way to control it. So there's a little door that opens and bypasses the exhaust gases so the turbos wouldn't over rev, and you can control the pressure that way. Now in this engine, to precisely control these wastegates, they're actually electronically controlled. They have a little motor that actuates and controls. This is not something new in the automotive industry, but to Toyota land, this is something exciting and this is something new. They can precisely control how much pressure these turbos are producing and how much to send back to the exhaust that we don't need. And they can do that because it's electronic. There's no vacuum involved. They can do that very precisely. The other thing is, and you remember in the cool old days of the Supra with the blow-off valve, that sound that you hear every time you let off the gas, that is a pressure bypass. Basically, the idea is when you close the throttle body, when you let go of the throttle, all that pressure that is there when the throttle body closes is just going to hit the throttle body and turn back and basically abruptly stop the turbo from turning. That could be very damaging. So the blow-off valve or the pressure release valve will take this excess pressure that now has nowhere to go but to return to the turbo and take it off circulation. But because this has mass airflows and this air is actually metered, it has been checked, it cannot just blow it to the atmosphere. It actually recycles it back into the intake of the turbo. So the turbo would take this pressure and pressurize it again. There's two valves, one for each bank on this, that are electronically controlled. There's, again, no vacuum, none of that. They're very small, and I don't recommend you actually you can take the hose and it'll make that cool sound, but it'll actually start throwing codes because that air that you release to the atmosphere will actually cause issues because that is metered air that passed through. Basically, that air is accounted for. If you let it out to the atmosphere, the computer will think, well, I have less air actually than what I'm metering, and that's a problem. Let's talk about the variable valve timing system. And dare I say old school, because things are actually old school, which was a big surprise with this engine. So the A25, the M20, they have a VVTi-E, which is an electronic VVTi. They use a motor. Things are very complicated. But here, it's actually all oil controlled. There's no fancy stuff. There's just a little solenoid in the front that pushes an oil control valve that is inside and changes the timing as needed. There's no wild angles to change it. It is big for modern standards. The amount of variance that the variable valve timing can change the timing, but not excessively large angle like the A25A, for example, that can go 70 degrees. Not in this engine. It is sufficient to keep things efficient, but it is also very simplistic and very easy to service and really robust. Doesn't have a lot of moving parts, just an oil control valve and a little solenoid that controls the oil control valve, which are actually right here. There's two of them in each side. Things are very simplistic. And last but not least, let's talk about the fuel system. And this has a D4ST because this is a turbocharged engine. It is basically the now not so new Toyota dual injection system. You have 6 port injectors and you have 6 direct injectors. You have the best of both worlds, really. There are times where direct injection is beneficial for efficiency, and there are times where port injection is beneficial. But the main drawback of direct injection only is carboning in the valves. When in this engine, you're not going to have that issue because you also have the port injection, which washes the valves when it runs in port injection mode. You have one high pressure fuel pump here, and then there's another fuel pump in the fuel tank. That high pressure pump, again, things are very loud when it runs in direct injection, and they quiet down when we go into port injection. Having said that, let us pick the truck up and let's look underneath it. We'll look at other system, the transmission, the suspension, and everything else. We'll continue on with the engine. Let's start in the front of the Tundra, and I'll share with you a few things. For DIY mechanics, there is a small cover right here, and then the oil filter is actually a spin-on filter, unlike the LS500, which has a canister. This is something very welcome. It actually has a little spout where the oil will come down. You can connect a little hose here, so you wouldn't make a mess at all. It's just the 4 bolts for the little cover here. It's actually not even a metal cover. It's a little fabric cover, as you see here. Super simple to remove, not really something big. But one thing that is interesting I found about the Tundra, which was also a surprise, there's actually 2 drive belts. There is one drive belt that goes only for the AC compressor, and then there is another drive belt that drives everything else. There's no power steering pump here, so things are more simple. You got the alternator and the water pump driven by the back belt, and the front belt only drives the AC compressor. That's actually pretty nice in case, when this thing has 250,000 miles and the AC compressor decides to lock up, you won't throw the main belt, you'll only throw the outside belt. That is actually an interesting touch. Very blocked here is actually the rest of the engine, other than the oil filter, by the massive motor for the electric power steering. I mean, this thing is huge. Of course, for a truck this big, it has to be this big. Otherwise, things are actually not extremely complicated. You have a little bit of room here. Possibly if you remove the shroud, you'll have a lot more room. Sway bar comes right here. Unlike before, where it used to come right here and cut your access, it is a little bit tucked to the back, so that's nice. Let's move on to the back and look at the oil pan. The oil pan is right here, the drain plug. It's actually a small oil pan. There's also a sub oil pan behind it. And the starter is actually right here. Seems a little less difficult to access than the previous generation, again, because you don't have the massive exhaust manifold here. Things are a little smaller. This is a very compact engine, so things are a little bit less cumbersome to access, which is nice. One thing about the compactness of this engine, the cylinder head bolts had to be different size to accommodate the compact design of the cylinder head, which is something very interesting, but it's a very compact engine. You look at it in the truck, it looks very, very crammed, but it's actually, once you take it out of the truck, it is actually not a very large engine. Let's talk about the transmission of the Tundra, which is a 10-speed transmission. This is all new on the Toyota side, and especially on the Tundra. Things are interesting here because the LS500 has a plastic oil pan for the transmission pan. This is actually metal. It sits a little too low, and you notice there's actually not a lot of covers on this. Everything is a little exposed. Nice when you work on it, but I would have wished there was a little bit more covering, but that's how they went with it, at least in this TRD Sport model. You have an overflow type. There's no dipstick here, of course. We are in 2022. There are a few old school touches about this transmission, believe it or not. There's actually a cable controlled shift. The shifter is cable actuated. The cable is right here on the side. It goes up to the cab. There is the thermostat that we know about, just like the previous generation, to control the flow of the fluid to the transmission cooler, which is actually inside the radiator, which is nice. Some people were concerned about this, but there's actually in the front, there is another transmission warmer deal, which actually uses coolant separate from the coolant of the radiator to warm up the transmission. It's a little bit of a little complication here. If you follow the lines, they're actually get a little complicated. They're not as simple as just going to the radiator and coming back, but the thermostat controls that. That is something we're familiar with. You know, when you change the fluid, you gotta pin the thermostat so you can have fluid going there all the time, so you can measure the fluid right. The fluid is simple. Now everybody dislikes the lack of dipsticks in newer cars, but this is actually not difficult. I've done a video and this is basically the same thing. Nothing really complicated about it. Now, one thing that is actually different than the previous Tundra, something that you will need to know about here. There is auto start stop, so when you stop, there is no longer pressure here. So when you start the engine and start going, there's a minute of a lag. So there's actually an electric oil pump inside this transmission that keeps the pressure up when you have an auto start stop event. That is something new. Not new to the Toyota lineup, because other models with auto stop start also have this, but new to the Tundra, so something to know about. And of course, this transmission, just like other Toyota transmission, this uses Toyota WS-ATF. Nothing really special or different there. Highly recommend that you replace it every 60,000 miles, and you won't have issues. Let's talk about the four-wheel drive system, starting with the transfer case. This gal over here is the WF1BM transfer case, and there is a major change that is a huge deal in the transfer case. This will make people smile. The shift actuator, you can now remove it without disassembling the whole transfer case. This is a major change. Folks, if you do not know why this is a major deal, before, if this actuator locks up, you know, you never used it for a very long time and it locks up, things happen. You have to disassemble this whole transfer case, and there are ways to do it, but then you risk damage and you have to take it apart, and it was a mess. It was an unnecessary mess. But no longer with the 2022 Tundra. All you have to do is be able to shift into two-wheel drive. Once you are in two-wheel drive, it's only a matter of a connector, 4 bolts, and the thing pops out and you can replace it on the spot. Bravo to Toyota for doing this. Thank you. This is a major deal. Things are very, very familiar otherwise. Transfer case, it's massive, it's very bulky and big. Sends power to the front, sends power to the back. Let's go look at the front differential. There's actually a major change in the front differential. The ADD actuator is actually inside the front differential. It is no longer something that you can just pull out easily. So I guess we have the actuator in the back that can be pulled out of the transfer case, but now the ADD actuator no longer is a serviceable easily part. It's inside. Can't win them all. That's what the design they went with. But otherwise, things are very familiar. You know, you got 2 CV axles. Things are actually simplistic, and I can see maybe why they went with this design, because there's a lot of space around. Usually when you work around the differential, things are very complicated and very compact. This thing is huge and has the idea, but this one is actually very compact. When you're looking at it, it doesn't look huge like the previous one. It does look more compact. Then we go in the rear end, where things changed drastically. Because now we have coil springs, things change significantly with the rear end. At least to me, it looks like the rear end is smaller, but it could be an optical illusion. But it does look different. It doesn't look massive and huge. It just looks like a normal size, almost like a 4Runner size or a GX size. It doesn't look massive like the previous Tundra. However, things are very different in how the rear end is mounted. Very similar mounted now to like a 4Runner, to a GX, to even a Land Cruiser. You have 5 arms that mount the differential in the back. You have this big arm in the front, you have 2 bottom one and 2 top ones. This is something very familiar. If you've looked underneath a 4Runner, this is exactly the same setup. Looks very familiar, super simple. Before, you only had the leaf springs, and that's the only thing that actually suspended this differential up in place, the housing itself. We have the same thing. The carrier separates from the housing. That design did not change, which is actually a very good design. And the axles are just floating axles. There's no locks here. You just pull the axles out, pull the carrier out, and there we go. Very simple design, rugged, works. Why change it? And they didn't, and I love them for that. I appreciate that. Let's talk about the suspension, starting with the parts that actually changed, and changed significantly. In the back, you no longer have the leaf spring, of course. You have coil springs. shock connects here. Things are very simple here. While we are looking at the suspension, let's also look at the brakes, because there's a small change with the brakes. In the back, you no longer have the parking brake integrated in the head of the rotor. You actually have an electronic actuator, so there's no more parking cable, there's no shoes, there's nothing. All you got is a motor here that when you engage the electronic parking brake, it just winds out the piston, locks the brakes, and that's that. Actually, it is a simpler design, and I understand folks dislike when things go electronic, but this is actually better. There's a lot less mechanical stuff that sees, that brake. Yes, this adds a little bit of a procedure to replace the rear pads, but it's actually not a complicated procedure. I have a video for it. It works very simple, super simplistic. And in the age of today, folks, I advise you that you keep up with how these cars are getting modern, DIY and the DIY side, because this is the way forward and you want to keep up with it, and you'll see that things are actually more simple with the modern stuff. Moving on to the front suspension, things look similar-ish. That's the word I'm going to use. You have a lower control arm, upper control arm, coilover setup, but the difference is, from what I can see, is the knuckle itself became aluminum. And they do this for weight. This is a lot lighter than the previous giant hunk of metal of a knuckle. This looks much lighter. Seems there is 4 hexes holding the wheel bearing on. That is something different. We used to have bolts. Now we have hex bolts, possibly to keep things compact. But everything else looks similar. Rack and pinion mounting wise, and you really, if you're familiar with the previous Tundra, things did not drastically change. Of course, everything looks different, but design wise overall, it'll be very familiar because things look similar, and that is welcome. You still have your eccentrics here to adjust for camber and caster. Everything else looks simple. On the steering, things are familiar, but the massive change is the electric power steering. Folks, this is a big deal, and really the main reason why they went with electric power steering is Toyota safety sense. You cannot control the steering, you know, when you do the lane tracing assist, you cannot control it with hydraulic power steering. It's just not possible. So now we have electric, and it's outside, and it's huge. Otherwise, the setup of the rack and pinion is very similar. It still goes through the frame, through openings in the frame, and things are familiar there. Not major changes here. Let's talk about some odds and ends that actually are strange or different about this new Tundra when compared to the previous one. The major one is the fuel tank. The fuel tank is actually super long and narrow, and it's on the passenger side. In the past, it used to be in the driver's side and the exhaust ran on the passenger side. Now it's the opposite. And this fuel tank looks huge. I mean, it is massive is the word for it. It is very, very large, and now on the passenger side. However, the filler neck is still, where you fill for fuel is still on the driver's side. So there's actually an over elaborate and super long filler neck that runs across from the passenger side, over the exhaust, over everything, almost near to the bed, all the way going that side. I find that kind of interesting, but that's the design they went with, and it's pretty different. And in the back of the Tundra, you have a spare tire. That is nothing strange. You have a chain to lock it. But over here, I noticed there's a big opening, just a giant open space that you can see all the way to the top of the bed. Same thing on the other side. That's kind of interesting. I don't remember seeing that in the previous Tundra. It was at least closed up a little bit better. But this, you can literally see to the top of the bed in the back. That's what they went with, and it's kind of interesting. Something else that is actually interesting about the wheels while we are here. There is a 6-lug design versus the previous Tundra, which has 5 lugs. The other significant thing is about this, it's not only 6, they're actually 21 millimeter lug nuts, not 22 anymore. So this is now similar to your 4Runner, Tacoma, all the other trucks, because the only ones that had the 22 millimeter lug nuts and the higher torque, and only 5 was the Tundra and Sequoia. But now the new Tundra has just 6 lugs, 21 millimeter, and life is good. The other major thing is You have the new style TPMS sensors, where the sensor programs itself after you install it. That's the first major thing. The second thing is the stem itself is rubber and is separate from the rest of the sensor. So if this rusts out, breaks, whatever the case may be, you don't have to replace the whole sensor. You could just replace the stem itself, which is actually pretty cool. One more thing about the massive grille. There are grille shutters behind the grille. Something pretty cool. This will really help warm things up faster in the winter time. These shutters will just close down and life is great. They only, however, shutter the middle radiator, not the side radiators for the intercooler, only the middle. Thought I mentioned this because this is actually cool to see it on a non-hybrid. Initially, the thought was this was going to be a hybrid exclusive, but I'm actually seeing it, and this is not a hybrid model, and it's there. And one more thing that is interesting to me, at least, through the wheel well, you can actually see the turbos really well. If you remove this cover, you can see the electronic actuator, you can see the inlet to the turbo. There's a lot more room on the side here because of the smaller engine. One last thing, do you remember the old Tundra had these rubbery covers here, like apron covers? This is plastic now. The front one is still that rubbery material, but the rear one is actually plastic, and it has a strange looking clip that I anticipate will be fun to remove and likely break, but that's what they went with. But this gives you much better access than the old V8. And this is the view with the cover on. I want to say one thing. This massive flap, it moves in and out for aerodynamics. When you do an oil change, these two bolts are extremely inaccessible. You have to put this flap in service mode. To do that, just shut off the truck, hold the wiper arm up, and this flap will open, and now you can get to the bolts super easy. 4 bolts, and the cover drops. Now you're accessing the filter. Super simple. One more thing, the battery location is interesting. It's on the passenger side all the way to the back. Gonna make service a little difficult because you gotta reach in, lift this battery, but they moved it from the driver's side to the front, all the way here tucked in the back. There is benefits and there is downsides to that, but I just wanted to point it out that was actually a major change to the location of the battery. Another thing is the brake system. Things are conventional, at least on the non-hybrid model. You have a conventional vacuum operated booster, you have a conventional master cylinder, ABS actuator right here. Things seem very, very normal here, nothing high tech. Only thing is you have a sensor on the booster. This engine, by the way, does have a vacuum pump because it has direct injection. So that vacuum pump actually supplies the booster with vacuum when the vacuum is low. Otherwise, things are very conventional and, dare I say, old school again. So that is your 2022 Tundra. I really like a lot of the updates that they did to this, like the transfer case actuator that comes out. The ADD is a little bit of a letdown, but let's hope it is reliable. On the four-wheel drive part, you still want to activate it every month or so just to keep things moving, just business as usual. Even though the actuator comes out in the transfer, you still want to do that. That is good practice on all Toyota four-wheel drive models. I like the Tundra drivetrain. I think it's a good move forward. That was one thing that let the previous Tundra down, was the gas mileage. I understand it's a big truck. This doesn't exactly get Prius gas mileage. For the short period of time that I drove this, it doesn't feel like I really missed the V8. It just felt peppy, there was no turbo lag, it had good power. Yes, I do miss the old V8, but you know what? It is time to move on and keep up with the paces, and I am very impressed by the very brilliant job that they did updating this truck, because it is really a looker. It looks inside and out, loaded with technology, and it looks really nice, and I cannot wait to get one to actually drive for a week and get a feel for it, which then I will give you a full review of how is it to live with day to day. This is just the technical review, so you can see what's behind the scenes and what makes the new Tundra cool. And folks, before we wrap up the video, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Breedeman Toyota in Park Ridge for allowing me to come in their shop, use their car to film this video. So thank you very much, Breedeman Toyota. Folks, I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos, and until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.